You sure you want to do this, old man? The voice cut through the air, sharp and dripping with mockery. Private Chris Miller, a fresh-faced recruit with more bravado than sense, stood with his arms crossed, staring down at the quiet, unassuming figure of John Harris. The air was thick with arrogance as the rest of the recruits snickered behind him. You're in the wrong place. This is for people who actually know how to shoot. John Harris didn't flinch. His hands, worn and weathered from decades of service, rested quietly on his knees. His grey hair, though thinning, held the weight of years spent in combat, and his pale blue eyes, though aged, remained sharp as ever. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone spoke volumes. But the recruits didn't know that yet. Well. Miller pressed, eyes narrowing with growing impatience. You're not gonna say anything? Maybe you can't even hear me. The young man's voice was a sneer, laced with dismissiveness. John's eyes flickered up to meet his for the briefest moment. Still, no words came. I thought so. All right, Gramps, let's see what you've got, Miller said, motioning to the range. The recruits laughed louder now, their chuckles echoing in the open air. They didn't understand. They didn't know that John Harris wasn't just some old man here for a casual afternoon. He had earned every wrinkle, every scar, and every silent moment of reflection. You want to shoot, who? Miller taunted, pulling a rifle from the rack. I'll let you try, but don't embarrass yourself. John stood slowly, the joints in his knees creaking with the effort, but his movements were deliberate, measured. He walked to the shooting line, his steady gaze scanning the targets in front of him. The recruits continued their mocking laughter, oblivious to the history standing before them. The range was set up for precision shooting, a series of targets placed at varying distances, all requiring a steady hand and a sharp eye. Miller, standing off to the side, watched with amusement. Let's see if you even hit the target, old man, he muttered under his breath. John raised the rifle, his grip firm yet gentle, the weight of the weapon feeling like a familiar extension of his body. He didn't rush. He never did. The younger recruits were still laughing, their voices rising with each moment. They didn't know what they were about to witness. John's eyes locked onto the first target. He steadied his breath, as he had done countless times in the heat of battle. Time seemed to slow. The world around him faded into the background. With a single, deliberate motion, his finger squeezed the trigger. The first shot rang out, striking the target dead center. The recruits fell silent. John moved on, his eyes still fixed on the next target. The shots rang out one by one, each one a perfect hit. The laughter died in the air. Miller's grin faltered as he watched in disbelief. John didn't rush. He took his time, as if each shot was a quiet reminder of the years spent honing this skill. When the last shot hit, the sound of the bullet hitting the target was the only noise that filled the air. There was no laughter now, no mockery. Only silence. The recruits, their faces pale and wide-eyed, stared at John, unsure of what to say. Captain Mark Davis, who had been observing from a distance, walked over, his expression unreadable. He looked at the targets, then back at John. Well, it seems you've shown them, Harris, he said, his voice low. John didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had said everything with his actions. The recruits, their pride shattered, stood frozen. They had laughed at the quiet veteran, and now they were learning just how wrong they had been. They weren't laughing anymore. The silence hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick and unrelenting. The sound of John Harris's shots echoed in the distance, each one a sharp reminder of the legacy he carried with him. The recruits stood still, their faces frozen in a mixture of awe and disbelief. Miller, who had once been so eager to mock, now stood with his mouth slightly agape, his usual cocky attitude stripped away by the sheer precision of the old man's skill. John lowered the rifle slowly, the weight of it seeming to remind him of battles long past, battles that had shaped him into the man he was today. His hands, though weathered by time, remained steady, the same hands that had once held rifles in faraway lands, where the stakes were much higher than any target practice could ever be. I didn't think, Miller started, his voice faltering. "I didn't think you could do it." John didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes, still calm and focused, shifted from the rifle to the young man standing before him. Miller opened his mouth to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to someone like this? What could he say to someone who had lived through things he could never understand? The other recruits, still in shock, slowly approached the firing line, their steps tentative, unsure of what to do next. They had all seen the same thing. They had all witnessed something that shattered the illusion they had built around themselves. A quiet veteran, dismissed as nothing more than an old relic, had just shown them what it truly meant to be a soldier. "You've got a hell of a shot, old man," Miller finally managed, his voice a little more respectful now. John simply nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. He had nothing to prove. Not to Miller. Not to anyone. Captain Davis stepped forward, his face unreadable. He had watched the entire exchange from the sidelines, his eyes narrowed, taking in every detail. He had seen the respect building in the recruits, the way they were slowly realizing the gravity of the moment. He was a man who knew what it meant to be in the military, to fight, to bleed, but even he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for the veteran standing before him. "That's enough for today," Captain Davis said, his voice low but firm. "You've all seen what true skill looks like. Now, I expect you to learn from it." The recruits, still in a daze, nodded silently. They had learned something they hadn't expected to today. Something far more valuable than any lesson they could learn from a textbook. Something that could only be gained through experience, through time spent in the trenches, through years of serving a cause greater than themselves. As the group began to disperse, Captain Davis lingered for a moment longer, his eyes still on John Harris. He couldn't help but wonder how many other veterans like him were out there, quietly going about their lives, unnoticed, unappreciated, yet holding the weight of the world on their shoulders. John's eyes met his for a brief moment, a silent understanding passing between them. No words were needed. They both knew what it meant to serve, to give everything, and to carry the burden of that service long after the battles had ended. With a final nod, John turned and walked away, his movement slow but deliberate. He didn't need their applause. He didn't need their recognition. He had already earned something far more valuable, respect. The next morning, the tension that had once hung thick in the air had shifted. The recruits, still adjusting to what they had witnessed, moved through their routines with an unease that hadn't been there before. Their steps were slower, their voices quieter, and there was an unspoken respect that hung between them like an invisible thread. John Harris had not been seen since the shooting range, but his presence lingered over them all. They had gone from mocking him to quietly admiring him, though none dared speak of it. They had learned something that day, something far beyond what they were trained to expect. Captain Mark Davis, however, had not forgotten. He had seen veterans like John Harris before, and he knew that this quiet man had stories buried deep within him, stories he wasn't ready to share. Stories of battles fought in places no one wanted to remember. Davis had been around long enough to understand the weight of silence. He knew the toll it took on men like Harris, men who had given everything and then some, only to return to a world that moved on without them. As the recruits filed into the mess hall, they were met with the familiar sounds of chatter and clattering trays. But today, something was different. The usual noise was subdued, as though the room itself had recognized the shift in the air. No one spoke about the shooting range, but every recruit who passed by John's usual seat took a moment to glance at him. Harris sat at the far end of the room, his back straight, his hands folded in front of him. He ate quietly, as he always did, and for the first time in a long while, no one laughed. No one made a joke at his expense. They simply watched him from a distance, unsure of what to say. Miller, who had once been so vocal in his mockery, now walked past him without a word, his eyes averted. The others followed suit, each one finding their own way to quietly acknowledge the man they had once underestimated. Captain Davis entered the mess hall, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted Harris immediately, sitting in the same spot, the same stillness surrounding him. But Davis saw something else, something the recruits hadn't noticed. There was a calm in the veteran's presence that seemed to command the entire room. The captain made his way over to Harris, his footsteps purposeful but not hurried. As he reached the table, he stopped, standing for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Harris didn't look up immediately. He continued to eat, his focus on the simple act of his meal, as if nothing had changed. But Davis knew better. He had seen men like Harris before, the ones who didn't need to speak, didn't need to boast. Their actions spoke louder than any words ever could. "John," Davis said quietly, his voice carrying just enough for the old man to hear. "I want to thank you for what you did yesterday. You reminded all of us what it means to be a soldier." Harris looked up slowly, his blue eyes locking with Davis's. There was no smile, no acknowledgement of the praise. Just a simple nod, as if the captain's words didn't need to be said. Harris had never been the type to seek validation. He had lived a life of service, and that life had shaped him in ways that made words unnecessary. "I didn't do it for recognition," Harris said, his voice steady but low. "I did it because I know what it takes." The captain nodded, his respect for the man deepening. He had known veterans like Harris, men who had sacrificed so much and yet asked for so little in return. But Davis had also learned something in that moment. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, silently, through actions, through experience. And Harris had earned it 1,000 times over, without saying a word. The recruits, still watching from a distance, had now seen what true strength looked like. It wasn't in the loud boasts or the flashy moves. It was in the quiet resilience, the calm under pressure, the understanding that some battles never truly end. Harris wasn't just a soldier. He was a reminder of the things they all hoped to become, strong, steady, and unwavering in the face of everything the world threw at them. The days that followed were quiet, but there was an unspoken shift in the air. The recruits no longer saw John Harris as just an old man. They saw him as something more. Every glance in his direction now carried a sense of reverence, a recognition of the life he had lived, the battles he had fought. And for the first time, they began to realize just how little they truly knew about what it meant to be a soldier. Captain Mark Davis continued to watch Harris closely. There was something about the old veteran that captivated him. It wasn't just the shooting, though that had been impressive. It was the way Harris carried himself, the way he moved through the world with a calm confidence that few others could match. Davis had been in the military long enough to know that true strength wasn't always visible. It didn't always come in the form of a loud proclamation or a show of force. Sometimes, it came in silence. Harris was a living testament to that. One afternoon, as Davis was making his rounds, he spotted Harris sitting alone on the steps outside the barracks, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The other recruits were gathered around, talking and laughing, but Harris remained apart from them, content in his own quiet world. Davis walked over, taking a seat beside him without saying a word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the recruits' voices faded into the background, leaving only the soft murmur of the wind and the distant hum of the bass. Finally, Davis broke the silence. "You ever think about the past, John?" Harris didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He knew the question was coming. It always did, eventually. He had lived a life filled with memories, but he had long ago learned not to dwell on them. "Sometimes," Harris said, his voice low and steady. "But what's the point? What's done is done." Davis nodded, understanding more than he let on. He had known soldiers who had struggled with the past, who had let it define them. But Harris wasn't like that. He wasn't someone who clung to the past. He carried it with him, but he didn't let it control him. "I guess that's one way to look at it," Davis replied, his voice thoughtful. "But it's hard, right? Not to carry it with you." Harris finally turned his head, his pale blue eyes meeting Davis's. There was a moment of understanding between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight they both carried, though for different reasons. "You can carry it," Harris said, his gaze never wavering. "But you can't let it break you. Life's too short for that." Davis sat back, processing the words. There was wisdom in Harris's simplicity, a clarity that came from experience, from a lifetime of service and sacrifice. It was a perspective that most of the recruits could never fully understand, not yet. Harris's past wasn't something he wore like a badge. It wasn't something he flaunted. It was part of him, and he carried it with quiet dignity. I've seen enough to know what's important, Harris continued, his voice almost a whisper. The rest, it doesn't matter. Davis glanced over at the recruits, who were now watching the two of them. The respect that had begun to build over the past few days was still there, unspoken but undeniable. Harris wasn't just an old soldier. He was a man who had earned his place, not through loud displays of power, but through the quiet strength of his character. The recruits were beginning to see that, beginning to understand that there was more to being a soldier than just following orders or shooting targets. It was about who you were, what you stood for, and how you carried yourself. Harris finished his coffee and stood up, his movement slow but deliberate. He didn't need to say anything more. He had already said enough. Davis watched him walk away, his thoughts a little heavier than before. He knew the recruits would remember this day, remember Harris's quiet wisdom, long after they had left the base. And maybe, just maybe, they would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. Weeks passed, and the dynamics within the barracks continued to shift. The recruits had settled into their routines, their voices no longer carrying the same mocking tone when John Harris was around. It was as though they had all silently agreed that he was not to be underestimated. The respect was there, unspoken but understood. Even Miller, who had once been the most vocal, now seemed to walk with a more measured step, his eyes occasionally drifting over to the old man with a quiet acknowledgement. Captain Mark Davis noticed the change as well. It was subtle, but it was there. The recruits were beginning to carry themselves differently. They were no longer just soldiers in training, they were starting to understand what it meant to be true soldiers. But it wasn't just the recruits who had changed. Davis found himself thinking about Harris more than he ever expected. It wasn't just the shooting, though that had been impressive. It was the way Harris approached everything. The way he moved through the world with quiet confidence, never speaking more than necessary, never seeking the spotlight, yet always commanding respect when he entered a room. It was a lesson that Davis, despite his years in the military, had never fully grasped. Harris's presence was a reminder that strength came in many forms. It didn't have to be loud or flashy. It didn't have to be about taking charge or being in the center of attention. Sometimes, true strength was simply about being steady. About standing your ground without needing to prove anything. One afternoon, as Davis walked through the barracks, he spotted Harris sitting alone outside, as he often did. The veteran was looking out over the training field, his eyes distant, as though lost in thought. Davis approached and sat beside him without a word. They both watched the recruits, now in the middle of their daily drills, moving with a newfound purpose. You ever think about teaching them more? Davis asked, breaking the silence. Harris turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting the captain's. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but clear. I've taught them what they need to know, Harris replied, his voice steady. The rest is up to them. Davis couldn't help but admire the simplicity of Harris's words. There was no grand speech, no need for praise or recognition. The lesson was in the silence, in the way Harris carried himself. It was in the quiet moments when no one was watching, when the weight of experience spoke louder than any words ever could. I think they are starting to get it, Davis said, his gaze drifting to the recruits. They're starting to see the bigger picture. Harris nodded but didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had already taught them what they needed to know. And in doing so, he had taught Davis as well. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the training field, Davis stood up, stretching his legs. He glanced at Harris one last time, a silent respect passing between them. There was no need for words. The captain knew that the true measure of a soldier wasn't in the medals or the accolades, but in how they carried themselves, how they faced each day with dignity, even when no one was watching. Harris had shown him that. And for that, Davis would always be grateful. As the weeks continued to unfold, a subtle shift occurred within the ranks. The recruits, who had once laughed and whispered behind John Harris's back, now found themselves quietly observing him from afar, as though learning from his every action. They didn't speak of it, but the respect was undeniable. They were different now, changed by the quiet presence of a man who had lived through battles they couldn't begin to understand. Captain Mark Davis noticed it too. He watched as the recruits moved through their drills with more purpose, more focus. The way they carried themselves had evolved. There was an unspoken understanding among them now, a recognition of the lessons Harris had quietly imparted without ever needing to teach them directly. It was the small things that had made the difference. The way the recruits held themselves, the way they addressed their fellow soldiers with more humility. The absence of the cocky bravado that had once defined their interactions. Davis couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't just about the drills or the exercises, it was about the deeper lesson they were learning, the kind of lesson that only time and experience could offer. One evening, after the day's training had concluded, Davis found himself walking alongside Harris, both of them heading toward the barracks. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the base. The air was still, the only sounds coming from the distant chatter of the recruits and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Davis glanced over at Harris, who was walking with his usual steady pace, his hands clasped behind his back. The old man's movements were slow but deliberate, each step measured with a quiet confidence that had come to define him. "John," Davis began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been meaning to ask you something. You ever think about what comes next? After all of this?" Harris didn't respond immediately. He kept walking, his eyes fixed ahead, as though considering the question in the silence between them. Finally, he spoke. "I've learned over the years that you can't always control what happens next," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You can only control how you handle it. You adapt, you move forward, and you do the best you can with what you've got." Davis nodded slowly, taking in the simplicity of the words. There was wisdom in them, a quiet strength that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of experience. Harris wasn't concerned with what came next because he understood something that Davis was still learning: life wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey, about how you carried yourself along the way. They reached the barracks, and Harris stopped just outside the door. He turned to Davis, his blue eyes meeting his for the first time since the conversation had started. "You know," Harris said, his voice quieter now, "the real test isn't in the battles we fight. It's in how we live after." Davis stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of the words. He had thought he understood what it meant to be a soldier, but Harris had shown him something deeper, something more profound. It wasn't just about the missions or the drills. It was about the quiet moments, the ones that didn't get celebrated or recognized. The ones that built character. "I think I'm starting to understand," Davis replied, his voice soft. Harris simply nodded and turned to enter the barracks, his footsteps steady and sure. He didn't need to say anything more. The lesson had already been learned. Davis stood for a moment longer, watching the old man disappear inside. The recruits were in there, preparing for another day, another round of training. But they weren't the same recruits who had arrived weeks ago. They had changed, and so had he. And for the first time, Davis realized that the true strength of a soldier wasn't measured in how fast they could run or how many targets they could hit. It was measured in how they carried themselves, in the quiet strength they displayed when no one was looking. The weeks seemed to blend together in a quiet rhythm, with each day marked by subtle changes. The recruits, once full of arrogance and youthful bravado, now carried themselves with a newfound respect. It wasn't just for John Harris, though he had certainly earned it. It was a deeper respect for what it meant to be a soldier, for what it meant to serve. Captain Mark Davis had noticed the transformation in them, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The shift wasn't just in their actions, it was in their attitudes. They were no longer looking for shortcuts, no longer relying on their confidence to carry them through. Instead, they were learning to trust their training and to value the lessons they were being taught. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the training field, Davis found himself walking alongside Harris once again. The air was cool, a light breeze stirring the leaves as they walked in comfortable silence. The sound of distant drills echoed across the base, but there was something peaceful about the moment. "You've been here longer than most of them," Davis said, his voice thoughtful. "You ever miss it? The action?" Harris didn't answer immediately. He kept walking, his pace steady, as if savoring the moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "I miss the camaraderie," he said. "The brotherhood that comes with serving. But the action, the battles, they're over. And they're not what I remember most." Davis looked at him, his curiosity piqued. "What do you remember then?" Harris turned his head slightly, his blue eyes meeting Davis's. There was a quiet depth in them, a lifetime of experiences that no words could ever fully convey. "I remember the quiet moments," Harris said, his voice carrying a weight that Davis hadn't expected. "The moments when everything stops, and you realize you're still here, still standing. When you see your brothers beside you, and you know you'd do anything for them. That's what stays with you." Davis nodded slowly, processing the words. It wasn't the grand battles, the victories, or the medals that defined a soldier's life. It was the quiet moments, the ones that no one saw, that truly mattered. "I never thought of it that way," Davis admitted, his voice soft. Harris gave a small smile, a flicker of something more human breaking through the calm exterior. "Most people don't," he said. "But that's why the ones who make it through the hardest times are the ones who understand." They continued walking, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. It was a lesson that Davis would carry with him for the rest of his career. It wasn't about the glory or the recognition. It was about the quiet strength, the resilience that came from within. Harris had shown him that. As they neared the barracks, the evening quiet settled in around them. The recruits were finishing their drills, their movements more focused, more purposeful. They were becoming soldiers, not just in skill but in spirit. And Davis knew, deep down, that this transformation had come not from the drills or the exercises but from the quiet example set by men like Harris. He watched as Harris walked away, his silhouette fading into the distance. There was no fanfare, no applause. Just the steady, confident stride of a man who had already proven everything he needed to prove. For Harris, the journey had never been about recognition. It had been about doing what needed to be done, without hesitation, without expectation. And for the first time, Davis realized that was the true measure of a soldier. Months had passed, and the transformation within the barracks had become more than just apparent. It was as though the very air had changed, heavier, charged with something deeper than just routine or drill. The recruits had evolved into a cohesive unit, no longer just individuals focused on their own success but a team that supported each other, each one understanding their role in a greater mission. They still looked to Captain Mark Davis for guidance, but they had begun to look to each other more often, their bond now fortified by their shared experiences. The most noticeable change, however, had been in the way they interacted with John Harris. He was still the same quiet, steady figure he had always been, but now, he was a source of quiet wisdom that none of them dared take for granted. It wasn't just that they respected him, it was that they had begun to realize that the things he did not say were often the most important lessons. One morning, as the recruits were preparing for their daily drills, Davis noticed something unusual. Harris was sitting on a bench just outside the barracks, a piece of paper in his hand. It was the first time in weeks that Davis had seen Harris off by himself, not training or observing, but simply sitting in silence. Davis walked over, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "John," he called, and the old man looked up slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting his. Harris gave him a slight nod, but said nothing, simply returning his attention to the paper in his hand. It was a letter, Davis realized. "Everything okay?" Davis asked, unsure whether he was overstepping. Harris didn't answer at first, and Davis wondered if he had made a mistake in approaching. But then, slowly, Harris folded the paper and looked back at him. "I was just remembering something," Harris said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Something from a long time ago." Davis took a seat next to him, his curiosity piqued. "You ever think about going back?" he asked, his voice careful. "Back to the life you had before?" Harris paused for a moment, his gaze drifting across the field. He didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular, but rather lost in the memories that played behind his eyes. "Sometimes," Harris said, his voice thick with an emotion Davis couldn't quite place. "But I don't live in the past anymore. I've learned better than that." Davis nodded, understanding more than he could say. It wasn't easy to let go of the past, especially when the weight of it hung so heavily around someone. But Harris was right. It was something Davis had yet to learn fully, the art of letting go. The recruits' voices echoed in the background as they prepared for the day's drills, their chatter filling the quiet space between them. "I've seen a lot," Harris continued, his words softer now, almost to himself. "Done things I'm not proud of, and things I'll never forget. But I learned that it's not the things you carry with you that make you who you are. It's what you choose to leave behind." Davis sat in silence, letting the words sink in. The lessons weren't always spoken aloud, but they were always there, woven into the fabric of Harris's every action, his every word. Harris had lived a life that few would ever understand, yet somehow, he had found a way to keep moving forward, to find peace in the quiet moments when everything else seemed to be moving too fast. "You're right," Davis said finally, his voice quiet. "But it's still hard sometimes. The past doesn't let go that easily." Harris turned to him then, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "No," he said, "it doesn't. But you can't let it drag you down. Not if you want to keep moving forward." The conversation lingered in the air long after it ended, and Davis found himself reflecting on Harris's words throughout the rest of the day. The recruits had finished their drills, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the barracks once more. But Davis couldn't shake the quiet wisdom Harris had shared with him. It wasn't about the battles won or lost, not about the medals or the glory. It was about learning to live with what you carried and knowing when to let it go. It was about finding peace in the moments in between. Harris had shown him that, in the quietest way possible. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next, but the recruits had begun to understand something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The lessons they had learned were no longer just about following orders or mastering techniques. They had learned to carry themselves with honor, to respect the quiet strength that came from within, the kind of strength that John Harris embodied so effortlessly. It was in the way he moved through the world, unbothered by the chaos around him, focused only on the task at hand. It was the way he never sought recognition, never needed anyone to tell him he had done well. His actions spoke for themselves. One morning, Captain Mark Davis stood watching the recruits from a distance, his arms folded across his chest. He had seen the transformation in them, a transformation that went beyond the physical. They were stronger now, but more importantly, they were better. They were learning the true meaning of service. As Davis stood there, his gaze shifted to John Harris, who was sitting on the edge of the training field, his weathered hands resting on his knees. There was something about the old man that had never quite left Davis's mind, the calm, the quiet dignity, the way he had never tried to be anything other than what he was. It wasn't just his skill on the range or his experience in combat that had impressed Davis. It was his ability to be at peace with himself. Davis approached Harris slowly, his footsteps purposeful but quiet, as though he didn't want to disturb the peace that seemed to follow Harris wherever he went. "John," Davis said, his voice soft. Harris turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting the captain's. There was no surprise in his gaze, just a quiet acknowledgement. "You ever think about what you want to do next?" Davis asked, his voice still low. Harris didn't immediately respond. He simply stared at the recruits in the distance, their movements more synchronized, their focus more deliberate. "I'm not sure I need to think about it," Harris said finally. "I've done enough. I've served, I've seen it all, and now it's time to let the next generation do their part." Davis looked at Harris, sensing that there was more to his words than what he had said. "You don't miss it? The action? The camaraderie?" he asked, trying to understand. Harris chuckled softly, his voice gravelly but warm. "I miss the people," he said. The ones who fought beside me. The ones who had my back when it mattered most. But the rest of it? It's all part of the past now. And I've made my peace with that. Davis nodded, a sense of quiet respect washing over him. He had learned more from Harris in these few months than he had in all his years of service. Harris wasn't just a soldier, he was a reminder of what it truly meant to serve. It wasn't about the battles or the glory. It was about the people you served with and the integrity you carried with you when everything else was gone. I think they're ready, Davis said, his voice reflecting a new level of understanding. Harris didn't look at him but nodded once. They'll figure it out, he said. They just need to remember that strength comes from inside. And they need to take care of each other. Davis stood there for a moment, watching the recruits, who had now noticed the two of them and were quietly going about their tasks. They didn't need to speak to understand the shift that had occurred. The change was in the way they carried themselves, the way they worked together without the need for constant supervision. The way they respected each other, just as they respected Harris. As Davis turned to leave, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. He had been trained to be a leader, but it was Harris who had shown him what true leadership was. It wasn't in the authority you held or the orders you gave. It was in the example you set, in the quiet strength that inspired others to follow. Harris had led without saying a word, and that was the greatest lesson of all.